I found out my wife was cheating, but her boyfriend thought she was single. You know that feeling. The one where you think your life is a perfectly constructed house of cards, stable and beautiful, and then you feel the slightest breeze? For 5 years, my life with Isabella was that house. We were both in our early 30s, at that age where you're supposed to have it all figured out. We had the mortgage on the suburban home, the 2 cars in the driveway, the golden retriever who chewed on my favorite sneakers. We had the kind of life that looks perfect on Instagram. And for a long time, I believed it was. Isabella was my college sweetheart, the kind of woman who could command a room with her laugh, but would still bring me a beer and a blanket without being asked. I trusted her implicitly. She was my anchor. The breeze started as a whisper. It was little things at first. A new password on her phone, which she'd never had before. When I asked, she laughed it off, saying a work security update forced a change, and it was just easier to make a new one. Plausible. Then came the late nights at the office. She was a project manager at a marketing firm, so overtime wasn't unusual, but this was different. She'd come home smelling not of coffee and office air, but of a different cologne, faintly, like a ghost in the room. She'd shower immediately, a habit she'd never had. I'd ask about her day, and her stories became vague, the details blurry, as if she was reciting a script she hadn't fully memorized. My gut, that primal instinct that so often we ignore in the name of rationality, started to hum with a low, persistent anxiety. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the routine of marriage was making me see shadows where there were none. But the doubt was a weed, and it was growing fast in the fertile ground of my fear. The real turning point, the moment the house of cards began to visibly tremble, was a Tuesday night. She called me, her voice bright and a little too cheerful. She said a big project had hit a snag and she'd be pulling an all-nighter with the team, ordering pizza and sleeping in one of the conference rooms. She promised she'd make it up to me. I hung up the phone and a cold dread washed over me. It was the specificity of the lie that got to me. It was too detailed, too practiced. I sat on the couch, the dog resting his head on my lap, and the silence of the house felt accusatory. My mind raced. I thought about the new password, the phantom cologne, the vague stories. I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years, the Find My Phone feature. We'd set it up on each other's phones years ago after a scare where she thought she'd lost hers in a taxi. We'd never turned it off. My hands were shaking as I picked up my own phone, my thumb hovering over the app icon. This felt like a line I couldn't uncross. Opening it would be an admission that I didn't trust her, that the perfect foundation of our marriage was cracked. But not opening it felt like willful ignorance, like letting myself be a fool. With a deep breath that felt like I was inhaling glass, I tapped the screen. A map loaded, a small green pin pulsing in the dark. It wasn't her office building. It wasn't a hotel near her office. It was a residential address, an apartment complex in a part of town I didn't recognize. My blood ran cold. I stared at the pin, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The house of cards wasn't just trembling anymore. A gust of wind was tearing through it. I had to know. I had to see it for myself. I grabbed my keys from the bowl by the door, the clatter of metal against ceramic echoing the chaos in my soul, and walked out into the night, leaving the perfect life I thought I had behind me. The drive across town was a blur of streetlights and internal screaming. Every scenario, every possible explanation played out in my head on a vicious loop. Maybe it was a coworker's apartment. Maybe they were all there, working late like she said. Maybe I was about to make the biggest fool of myself, confronting an innocent group of people fueled by my own insecurity. But that other voice, the cold, logical one, kept whispering that I was driving towards the truth, a truth I wasn't ready for. The GPS on my phone guided me with a calm, disembodied voice that felt like a personal insult. In 200 feet, turn right. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The neighborhood was older, with tree-lined streets and apartment buildings that had seen better decades. It was the kind of place where secrets could live comfortably in the dark. I pulled into the parking lot of the complex, my headlights sweeping across a row of parked cars. And then I saw it, her white SUV, parked halfway down the row, unmistakable. The little Live, Laugh, Love decal on the back window, which I had always found a bit cheesy, now seemed like a cruel joke. I parked a few spaces away, killing the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I sat there for a long moment, a war raging inside me. Part of me wanted to start the car, drive home, and pretend I never saw anything, go back to the blissful ignorance. But I knew I couldn't. The image of her car, parked under a dim streetlight in a strange place, was burned into my retinas. I had to know. I got out of the car, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. The night air was cool, but I was sweating. I walked towards the building, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. I found the entrance corresponding to the address on my phone and stood before a heavy beige door. I could hear the faint thump of a bass line from inside, muffled by the walls. My heart was a frantic drum solo against my sternum. I raised my hand to knock, but it froze in midair. What was I going to say? What was I going to do? There was no script for this. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I forced my knuckles to connect with the door. 3 sharp, decisive raps. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet hallway. I heard the music inside cut off. A moment of silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching the door. The deadbolt turned with a heavy thunk. The handle twisted and the door swung inward. It wasn't Isabella who answered. It was a guy. He looked to be around my age, maybe a little younger, with a kind face and messy brown hair. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and he held a half-eaten slice of pizza in his hand. He looked at me with a pleasant, questioning expression, completely oblivious. Over his shoulder, I could see into the apartment. It was a typical bachelor pad, a leather couch, a big TV, a few scattered beer bottles. And then I saw her. Isabella was standing by the couch, a wine glass in her hand. She was wearing one of my favorite dresses of hers, a simple blue one that brought out her eyes. When her eyes met mine, the color drained from her face. The wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor with a sound like a final cracking chord. The guy at the door turned to look at the sound, then back at me, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. He started to ask if everything was okay, but his voice trailed off as he looked from my devastated face to Isabella's horrified one. He had no idea who I was. And in that moment, I realized this story was far more complicated than I had ever imagined. The guy's confused gaze bounced between Isabella and me. He opened his mouth, a silent question forming on his lips, but Isabella beat him to it. She started moving, her words a frantic whispered torrent that I couldn't quite make out from the doorway. She was gesturing wildly, first at me, then at herself, her face a mask of pure panic. It was the performance of a lifetime, a desperate attempt to control a narrative that was already spiraling far beyond her grasp. The guy, whose name I would later learn was Liam, just stood there, the pizza slice forgotten in his hand, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and dawning dread. He looked like a man who was realizing the floor he was standing on was about to give way. I didn't look at Isabella. I couldn't. My eyes were locked on Liam. I slowly raised my left hand, holding it up so the light from the hallway caught the simple gold band on my 4th finger. The gesture was small, quiet, but it landed with the force of a nuclear explosion. Liam's eyes followed my hand, and for a second, he just stared at the ring. Then his gaze shot back to my face, and the pieces clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. The confusion in his eyes vanished, replaced by a look of utter, soul-crushing devastation. It was the same look I had seen in my own reflection that morning. He was a victim. He was just as much of a victim as I was. Isabella's frantic whispering died in her throat as she saw the look on his face. She knew she had lost. She had been caught, not by one man, but by 2, in a web of her own making. I took a step back from the door, my voice hoarse when I finally spoke. I didn't yell, I didn't scream. I just told him we needed to talk, suggesting we step outside, away from her. He nodded numbly, his eyes still wide with shock. He placed the pizza slice on a small table by the door, a mundane, almost comical action in the middle of the chaos. As he followed me out into the cool night air, I risked a glance back at Isabella. She was standing in the middle of the living room, surrounded by the wreckage of her wine glass, looking small and broken. But I felt no sympathy, only a cold, hard emptiness. We didn't go far, just to the far end of the parking lot, under the flickering glow of a malfunctioning security light. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. We just stood there, two strangers bound by a single monumental lie. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice cracking. He told me everything. He'd met Isabella at a work conference 3 months ago. She'd told him she was single, that she had just gotten out of a long, toxic relationship and was taking her time getting back into dating. He said she was incredible, funny, smart, and he'd fallen for her, hard. He showed me his phone, pulling up their text history. There were dozens of messages from her talking about her freedom, her new beginning, and how excited she was to finally be with someone who treated her right. Each message was a fresh dagger in my heart. As I scrolled through the digital evidence of her betrayal, I saw my own life being rewritten, my existence erased with every tap of her thumb. We stood there for nearly an hour, sharing our stories, our confusion, our pain. We weren't enemies anymore. We were unwilling allies in a war we never asked for. And then, as we were about to part ways, he mentioned something that changed the entire game. He told me he was supposed to be her date to her company's big holiday party on Friday. He was going to meet her boss and all her colleagues. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. I had an idea. The idea that sparked between us in that dimly lit parking lot was born not of revenge, but of a need for truth. A simple, public, undeniable truth. Liam's mention of the holiday party was a gift, a stage perfectly set for a final act. Isabella cared about her career more than anything. It was her identity, her source of pride. Exposing her there, in front of the very people whose respect she craved, wouldn't just be a breakup. It would be a complete dismantling of the false life she had so carefully constructed. It was poetic. It was just. We exchanged numbers, a strange modern-day truce between two men who should have been rivals. As I drove home that night, the rage that had been fueling me had cooled, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. The house was dark and empty when I walked in. The silence was no longer accusatory. It was a blank canvas. I knew what I had to do. The next 2 days were a blur of clandestine planning. Liam and I communicated through encrypted messages, feeling like spies in a low-budget thriller. We met at a neutral coffee shop, the kind of place with indifferent baristas and the constant hum of an espresso machine to cover our conversations. We laid out our strategy with the precision of military generals. The goal was maximum impact with minimal chaos. We didn't want a screaming match. We wanted a moment of pure, crystalline exposure. Liam's role was crucial. He had to play his part perfectly, to act the part of the doting boyfriend until the exact right moment. He would go to the party with her, smile, make small talk, and let her introduce him around. He would be the Trojan horse. My role was to be the bomb. I would arrive unannounced, mid-party. The timing had to be perfect. Too early, and the room wouldn't be full enough. Too late, and people would have already left. We decided on 9:30. It was the sweet spot, when the open bar had loosened everyone up, but before the event started to wind down. We gathered our ammunition. I had a digital photo album on my phone, a highlight reel of our 5-year marriage, our wedding day, vacations, holidays, lazy Sundays on the couch. Each picture was a piece of evidence, a testament to a life she had tried to erase. Liam, in turn, saved the most incriminating of their text messages, the ones where she explicitly stated she was single and unattached. We synchronized our watches, a final theatrical touch that felt both ridiculous and necessary. On Friday, the day of reckoning, a strange calm settled over me. I went to work, I answered emails, I attended meetings. I acted normal, but underneath the surface, I was a coiled spring. I could feel the potential energy building, waiting for its release. At 7 o'clock, I got the text from Liam, a simple thumbs-up emoji. He was on his way to pick her up. An hour later, another message came through, a photo of Isabella dressed to the nines in a black velvet dress, smiling up at him. The caption read, "She just introduced me to her boss, said I was the best thing to happen to her this year. I'm going to be sick." I stared at the picture, at her beautiful, smiling face, and felt nothing. It was like looking at a photograph of a stranger. The last piece of my emotional attachment to her had been severed, replaced by a grim sense of duty. At 9:15, I put on my coat, grabbed my keys, and headed for the door. The final text from Liam came as I was starting my car. "I'm here. The room is packed. She's loving the attention. Ready when you are." I took a deep breath, put the car in drive, and pointed it towards the city, towards the hotel where my wife's carefully curated world was about to come crashing down around her. The venue was a grand ballroom in a downtown hotel, all crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. It was exactly the kind of ostentatious, impressive place Isabella loved. As I walked through the lobby, my heart was a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. The anger was gone, replaced by a sense of surreal detachment, like I was an actor in a movie, and this was the climactic scene. I could hear the muffled sounds of the party from behind a set of heavy oak doors. The low thrum of a pop song, the indistinct murmur of 100 conversations, the occasional burst of laughter. I took a moment, straightening my tie and taking one last deep breath. Then I pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The scene that greeted me was a vision of corporate holiday cheer. People in cocktail attire milled about, glasses of wine and champagne in hand. A giant decorated Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights twinkling merrily. It all felt so normal, so mundane, which only heightened the absurdity of my mission. My eyes scanned the crowd, searching for her. It didn't take long. She was standing near the bar, the center of a small group of people, holding court. She was radiant, her laugh cutting through the noise of the room. And next to her, looking profoundly uncomfortable in a slightly too tight suit, was Liam. He was nursing a beer, his eyes scanning the room with a nervous energy I recognized instantly. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second across the sea of people. He gave me an almost imperceptible nod. The signal. I began to walk towards them, my steps slow and deliberate. I didn't weave through the crowd. I walked a straight line, a path of intention. People parted for me, sensing a purpose they couldn't quite identify. As I got closer, I could see the details more clearly. Her boss, a stern-looking man with silver hair I recognized from her office party photos, was listening to her intently. She was telling a story, her hands gesturing expressively. She was in her element, the star of her own show. I was about to change the channel. I was still 20 feet away when she saw me. Her smile didn't just fade, it vanished, as if it had never been there. Her face went pale, the color draining away so quickly it was startling. Her eyes widened in a mixture of terror and disbelief. The story she was telling died on her lips, leaving a sudden, awkward silence in her little circle. She tried to recover, turning away from me, as if she could pretend I wasn't there. She put a hand on Liam's arm, trying to pull him towards the dance floor, a desperate attempt at escape. But Liam stood his ground, his feet planted firmly. He looked at her, then at me, a silent apology in his eyes. He was ready. I was now just a few feet away. The small group around them had noticed the shift in atmosphere, their curious eyes flicking between Isabella's panicked face and my steady approach. The stern-looking boss, Mr. Henderson, had a look of mild annoyance on his face, as if I was an unwelcome interruption. He had no idea. None of them did. I stopped directly in front of my wife. The silence around us expanding to swallow the noise of the entire party. The air was thick with unspoken words and impending doom. This was it, the moment of truth. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. My calmness was the most powerful weapon I had. I simply stood there, my gaze fixed on Isabella, letting the silence stretch and warp under the pressure. Her eyes were darting around, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. She opened her mouth, but only a small strangled sound came out. The people around us were staring now, the festive atmosphere replaced by a tense, voyeuristic curiosity. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, about to say something, but I held up a hand, silencing him before he could start. Then, I did something that no one expected. I turned to Liam and I gave him a small, sad smile. I reached out and clapped him gently on the shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that was completely baffling to the onlookers. Isabella's face was a canvas of horror. She watched my interaction with Liam, her mind struggling to process a reality that defied all logic. I then turned my attention back to her, and slowly, deliberately, I raised my left hand, extending my fingers so the simple gold band on my ring finger caught the light from the chandelier above. It was the same gesture I had used in the apartment doorway, but this time it had an audience. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A woman standing next to Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Mr. Henderson's eyes narrowed, his annoyance turning to sharp, calculating suspicion as he looked from my ring to Isabella's bare hand. The lie was unraveling in real time, in the most public way possible. Liam, to his credit, played his part perfectly. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his face a mask of feigned sadness. He didn't look at me or Isabella. Instead, he turned to the woman who had gasped, a coworker of Isabella's, and showed her his screen. Her eyes widened as she read whatever was there, likely one of Isabella's "I'm so single and happy" texts. She immediately showed it to the person next to her. The digital evidence began to circulate through the small group like a virus, each new person's expression morphing from confusion to shock to dawning understanding. Isabella was trapped, a specimen under a microscope. She started to sputter, a frantic stream of denials and explanations, but her words were a jumbled mess. She pointed at me, calling me a liar, an ex who couldn't let go. She pointed at Liam, calling him a stranger she'd never seen before. The desperation was palpable, pathetic. I just stood there, a silent, immovable object in the path of her unstoppable train of lies. I had come here for a confession, but watching her self-destruct was far more effective. The entire party had ground to a halt. The music had stopped. Everyone was watching the spectacle unfold. And then, cornered, exposed, and utterly defeated, Isabella did the only thing she had left to do. She snapped. But she didn't turn her rage on me or Liam. She spun around, her finger jabbing through the air like a weapon, and she unleashed a final desperate accusation at her boss, Mr. Henderson. An accusation that had nothing to do with me, but everything to do with her. The words she screamed, raw and laced with a venomous fury, cut through the stunned silence of the ballroom. Affair! She pointed a trembling finger directly at Mr. Henderson, her face contorted with a rage so pure it was terrifying. She followed it up with a torrent of accusations, her voice cracking with emotion. She claimed he had been pursuing her for months, that her promotion was contingent on her compliance, that she had been trying to find a way out, which is why she had sought comfort with Liam. It was a masterpiece of deflection, a nuclear option designed to burn the entire world down around her. The problem was, as she screamed her truths and half-truths, a flicker of recognition, not of shock, passed over Mr. Henderson's face. It was a look of a man who had been caught, not of a man who had been falsely accused. The ballroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a horrified, electrified silence. This was no longer a story about a cheating wife. It was a corporate scandal unfolding in real time. People from the HR department, who had been enjoying the open bar moments before, suddenly sprang into action, rushing towards the escalating situation with a sense of professional panic. Mr. Henderson, a man who had built a career on control and authority, was visibly pale, his composure shattered. He started barking orders, trying to regain control of the narrative, but it was too late. The damage was done. Isabella, in her final, desperate act of self-preservation, had not only exposed her own infidelity, but had also detonated a bomb under her boss's career. She had torched her entire professional life in a matter of seconds. Liam and I exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated shock. This was so far beyond the scope of our plan that it was almost laughable. We had come to expose a lie, and we had inadvertently uncovered a much deeper, more sinister one. We were no longer needed here. Our part in this drama was over. Without a word, we both began to back away from the epicenter of the explosion, melting into the stunned crowd. We walked out of the ballroom, through the lobby, and into the cool night air, leaving the chaos behind us. The city lights seemed to blur together as we stood on the sidewalk, the sounds of the party fading behind us. We were two strangers who had entered the night as enemies and were leaving it as the only two people who truly understood the magnitude of what had just happened. We ended up at a dive bar a few blocks away, the kind of place with sticky floors and a jukebox that only plays classic rock. We didn't talk much at first. We just sat there, two survivors of a shipwreck, drinking cheap beer and watching the game on TV. But eventually, we started to talk. Not about Isabella, but about us. About our jobs, our families, our stupid hobbies. We found out we both hated cilantro and loved old horror movies. In the ashes of my marriage, a strange, unexpected friendship was born. The fallout was swift and brutal. The divorce was messy but straightforward. The evidence of her affair was undeniable, and her public meltdown at the party didn't help her case. She lost her job, and I heard through the grapevine that Mr. Henderson was retiring to spend more time with his family. I sold the house, bought a smaller condo, and started the long, slow process of putting my life back together. It was hard, but it was honest. And as I sat in my new, quiet apartment, I would sometimes think about that night. I thought about the betrayal, the anger, the pain, but more often, I thought about Liam. I thought about the strange, twisted way life works, how the person you think is your adversary can turn out to be your only ally. My house of cards had been blown away, but standing in the wreckage, I found I wasn't alone. And somehow, that made all the difference.